The challenge arrived not as a whisper, but as a decree, broadcast on every frequency the galaxy had ever agreed to share. It came from the Concord Armada, and there had never been anything like the Concord Armada. For 11,000 years it had been the single fact around which every treaty, every border, every quiet surrender in the spiral arm had been arranged. 40,000 warships, 9,000 of them larger than moons, crews drawn from 200 client species who had learned, generation by generation, that to serve the Armada was the only life that did not end in fire. When the Concord Armada moved, stars were counted as terrain. When it spoke, the answer had always been yes. Now it spoke to Earth. The message was elegant in the way that only true confidence can be. It did not threaten. It did not rage. It simply informed. Humanity, the decree said, had grown too quickly, spread too far, and armed itself too well for a species that had never been formally weighed. The Concord Armada would therefore weigh it. In 90 of Earth's days, at the neutral marches beyond the star the humans called Kesarai, the Armada would arrive in full. Humanity was invited to bring whatever fleet it could muster, and to test itself against the greatest concentration of firepower the galaxy had ever assembled. The outcome, the decree assured them with something like courtesy, was not in question. But the form of the outcome, whether humanity joined the Concord as a client or ended as an example, would be decided by how humanity comported itself in the trial. The Armada believed in giving the weighed their dignity. It had, after all, weighed everyone. Grand Marshal Vostalerian, who had commanded the Armada for 6 of his species' long lifetimes, appended his personal seal. It was the first time in 4 centuries he had bothered. On Earth, the decree was received in 140 languages and understood in all of them the same way. The humans did the math. 40,000 warships. Earth had, at that moment, 612 vessels rated for deep combat, and most of those were not warships at all but converted haulers, survey ships, and the long-range patrol cutters that policed the mining lanes. The disparity was not a disparity. It was a category error. It was the difference between a storm and a raindrop, and every admiral who read the numbers understood that the Concord Armada had not issued a challenge. It had issued a formality, the polite paperwork that a predator files before it eats. The Admiralty met for 19 hours. When they emerged, they had agreed on exactly one thing, which was that they did not intend to be an example. Lieutenant Commander Ada Aconquires was 29 years old when the decree came, and she found out about it the way most of the fleet found out, which was late, tired, and covered in coolant. She was 3 decks down in the belly of the survey ship Meridian Lark, wrist-deep in a gravitic sink that had been failing intermittently for 6 days, and had chosen that morning to fail permanently. Her arm was numb to the elbow from reaching past the field baffles. Her hair was tied back with a length of signal cable, because she had lost her last 3 tie bands to the same maintenance gremlin that ate everyone's tools. She had been an officer for 7 years and a good one, and she had spent most of those 7 years exactly like this, solving small, stubborn, physical problems in the guts of ships that other people flew. The Meridian Lark was not a warship. She was a cartography vessel, one of the long-endurance survey craft that mapped the gravitic reefs and stellar hazards along the frontier so that colony ships would not blunder into them. Ada had asked for the posting. Everyone had thought this was strange. She was a gifted combat systems officer with a rare intuition for fire control, and she could have had a berth on any of the patrol cutters, could have been chasing pirates, and building the kind of record that made captains. Instead, she had asked for the ship that went slowly through the dark and looked at things, and she had spent 3 years learning the frontier the way you learn a lover's face, every reef and eddy and dead star, until she could feel the shape of a gravity well before her instruments confirmed it. When the general alert chimed, she assumed it was a drill, because everything was always a drill. She kept working. It was only when the ship's captain came down to the engineering deck personally, which captains did not do, that she pulled her arm out of the sink and turned around. Captain Idris Hale was 60 and looked older, a spare, gray man who had flown survey routes since before Ada was born, and who spoke so rarely that the crew had learned to read his silences. He was silent now for a long moment, standing in the low blue light of the engineering deck, and then he told her. She listened. She wiped her hands. She did the math the same way every human in the fleet did the math, and reached the same conclusion, which was that the numbers were not survivable. "How long?" she asked. 89 days, Hale said, "as of this morning." "And the fleet?" 600 ships, give or take. Ada looked at the gravitic sink she had been repairing, the small, stubborn, honest problem of it, and understood that it no longer mattered whether she fixed it. She understood something else too, though it would take her days to put it into words. She understood that the galaxy had just made a mistake. Not a moral mistake, though it was that. An arithmetic one. The Concord Armada had counted 600 ships and 40,000 ships, and concluded that it understood the difference between them. It had counted the wrong thing. "They gave us 90 days, she said slowly. Hale watched her. He had commanded a great many young officers, and he had learned to recognize the particular stillness that came over the good ones when they stopped being afraid and started being interested. They did. "That's not a challenge," Ada said. "That's homework." The Concord Armada did not, as a rule, give its opponents time. This was the first thing that struck the human strategists as they tore the decree apart, phrase by phrase, in the long gray rooms of the Admiralty. An overwhelming force does not offer a countdown. If your intention is simply to destroy, you arrive without warning, at the moment of maximum advantage, and you are gone before the survivors can organize their grief. The Armada had done exactly this to hundreds of species across 11,000 years. There were whole civilizations that existed now only as a line in the Concord's ledger, weighed and found wanting and erased between one dawn and the next. So why the 90 days? The answer, once the humans found it, told them everything they needed to know about the enemy. The Concord Armada did not merely conquer, it performed conquest. Its power was so total that mere victory no longer interested it. What interested it was the demonstration, the public and unambiguous proof, witnessed by 200 client species, that resistance was not a tragedy but an absurdity. The 90 days were a stage direction. They existed so that humanity would gather its full strength, so that every human who could fight would be present, so that when the Armada crushed them it would crush not a fraction but a totality, and the lesson broadcast to the watching galaxy would be complete. Bring everything, the decree said, beneath its courtesy. Bring everything so that nothing remains to wonder whether it might have made a difference. The Armada wanted the humans assembled. It wanted them proud. It wanted them certain enough to show up. The humans, reading this, felt the first cold flicker of something the Conquered had not accounted for. Because a species that has spent its whole history as prey, that clawed its way up from a world where it was neither the fastest nor the strongest nor the most numerous, that survived ice and famine and its own relentless capacity for self-destruction, learns one lesson above all others. It learns that when a predator gives you time, the predator has made an error. Time is the only weapon the weak have ever had, and the Conquered Armada, in its 11,000 years of perfect confidence, had just handed humanity 89 days of it. Fleet Admiral Sarah Chenbury, who commanded what there was of the human fleet, put it plainly to the assembled Admiralty on the second night. "They think they're giving us a chance to make our peace," she said. "They're giving us a chance to prepare. They cannot tell the difference, because in 11,000 years no one has ever done anything with the time but weep. We are going to do something else." She was a small woman with an iron voice, and she had spent 30 years arguing that the fleet's obsession with big ships was a vanity Earth could not afford. She had been mostly ignored. She was not ignored now. "We cannot outmass them," she said. We cannot outgun them. Forget it. Put it out of your minds entirely, because every hour we spend imagining a fleet that could stand against theirs is an hour stolen from the war we can actually fight. We are not going to fight their war. We are going to fight ours. And to do that I need to know, from every ship and every yard and every laboratory on this planet, not what we have, but what we know. The distinction mattered more than anyone in that room yet understood. The Concord Armada was a fleet of things. 40,000 warships, 9,000 larger than moons, a mass of matter and weaponry so vast that it distorted the space it passed through. Its strength was inventory. You could count it. The Armada itself counted it constantly, obsessively, because inventory was the whole of its identity, and it had measured humanity's inventory against its own and found the ratio comforting. But humanity had never been able to win on inventory, not once in its history. It had always been outnumbered, outmassed, outtoothed, and outclawed, and it had survived anyway, and the survival had left a residue in the species, a deep and unglamorous genius that the conquered had no word for and no way to measure. Humans did not count things. Humans understood things. They took the world apart to see how it worked, and then they put it back together wrong, on purpose, in ways that did what they needed instead of what it was designed to do. They were, above all else, the species that improvised, and improvisation does not show up in a ledger. The Armada had weighed humanity's ships and missed humanity's mind. In the weeks that followed, this mind went to work, and it went to work in a way no massed fleet in the galaxy had ever seen, because it was not organized like a fleet at all. It was organized like a swarm of curious, frightened, brilliant primates who had been handed a puzzle and told that the price of failure was extinction. Every research institution on Earth and in the colonies was pulled into a single, sprawling, sleepless effort. Every retired engineer, every graduate student, every backyard tinkerer with a workshop and a theory was invited to contribute, because the Admiralty had made a decision that would have been unthinkable in any hierarchical military and was simply obvious to humans. They were not going to solve this from the top down. There was no genius at the top who could outthink 40,000 warships. The answer, if there was one, would come from everywhere at once, or it would not come at all. Ada Conquerez received her orders on the fourth day. She had expected to be transferred to a combat billet, to be handed a fire control station on some cutter, and told to die well. Instead, she was ordered to remain aboard the Meridian Lark, and the Meridian Lark was ordered to do the one thing it had always done, which was to go slowly through the dark and look at things. Specifically, it was ordered to look at Kesarai. Kesarai was the star the Concord Armada had chosen for the trial, and it had been chosen, the humans assumed, at random, one more anonymous point on the frontier where a species could be made an example without inconveniencing anyone the conquered cared about. The neutral marches beyond it were empty, unclaimed, dead. There was nothing there. That was the point. The Armada wanted a clean stage. But nothing in space is truly empty, and no one knew the frontier better than the survey ships, and no one aboard the Meridian Lark knew the reefs and eddies of the deep dark better than the young officer, with the rare intuition for the shape of a gravity well. Ada spent her first week with the assignment simply reading. She pulled every survey the human fleet had ever made of the Kesarai marches, some of them her own, and she overlaid them, and she sat in the dim cartography bay of the Meridian Lark with the whole region rendered in light around her, turning slowly, and she looked at it the way she looked at everything, which was to ask not what it was but what it was doing. Kesarai was an old star, a bloated red giant in the slow years before its collapse, and it was shedding mass the way old giants do, a constant thin wind of stellar matter bleeding off into the dark. This was ordinary. Every dying star did it, but Kesarai was not alone. It had a companion, a dense collapsed remnant, a neutron star locked in a long, slow orbit, and the two of them had been dancing for 1 billion years, and the dance had done something to the space between and around them. The neutron star was eating its giant companion. Slowly, thread by thread, it pulled the shed matter of the red giant into a vast spiral, a disk of superheated plasma wound tight by gravity into a structure that spanned most of the volume where the Armada intended to assemble. And that structure was not stable. It flickered. It surged. The survey data, taken across 3 years, showed the whole region pulsing on a long, slow, irregular rhythm as the accretion disk built and collapsed and built again. And each surge sent a wave of gravitic distortion, rippling out through the marches like the swell of a tide. The Concord Armada, Ada realized, had chosen to hold its trial in the middle of a tide pool. And the Armada, which counted things, which measured mass and firepower and range, which had reduced the entire art of war to inventory, had almost certainly not noticed. Why would it? The tide was slow. It was subtle. It would not damage a warship or even inconvenience one. It was, from the perspective of a fleet that thought in gigatons of throw weight, entirely beneath notice. But Ada Aconquires did not think in gigatons. She thought in the shape of gravity wells, and she had just found a gravity well the size of a solar system that no one on the enemy side was watching. She did not yet know what to do with it, but she knew, the way she knew when a failing part was about to give, that she had found the thing. The homework had an answer, and the answer was hidden in the one place the Concord Armada would never think to look, which was in the terrain itself, in the slow breathing of a dying star that a fleet of 40,000 warships had dismissed as an empty stage. She sent a single line to the Admiralty that night, and it moved up the chain faster than anything she had ever sent. "The stage is not empty," she wrote. "The stage is a weapon. We just have to learn to pull the trigger." The message reached Fleet Admiral Chenbury at the end of a day in which she had told 400 people, in various ways, that their plans would not work. She had heard by then every kind of proposal a desperate species could generate. She had heard the ones that were merely brave, the sortie-and-die plans that assumed the human fleet's job was to sell its lives at the highest possible price. She had rejected them. Dying well was not a strategy. It was a consolation, and she had not gathered the finest minds on earth to arrange a consolation. She had heard the ones that were merely clever, the plans that assumed some single trick, some superweapon or hidden gambit, could substitute for the fleet humanity did not have. She had rejected those too, because she had learned in 30 years that the enemy who counts on a single trick has already lost, since a single trick can be countered by a single mind, and the Concord Armada had many minds and 11,000 years to have thought of everything. What she was waiting for, though she could not have said so, was a plan that did not try to beat the Armada at all. A plan that treated the Armada not as an opponent to be outfought, but as a force of nature to be redirected. She was waiting for someone to stop thinking about the fleet and start thinking about the field the fleet would stand in. When she read the young lieutenant commander's message, she read it 3 times, and then she called for the survey data. And she spent the whole of that night alone in her office with the Kesarai marches rendered in light around her, turning slowly, breathing with the long, slow rhythm of a dying star. By morning she had made 2 decisions. The first was that she believed it. The second was that she needed the person who had found it, because a discovery is not a plan, and the gulf between them was 90 days wide and closing. She had the Meridian Lark recalled, and she had Ada Aconquires brought to Earth. Ada had never been in a room like the one they put her in. It was buried beneath the Admiralty, a great vaulted chamber that had once been a reservoir and now held the coordinating heart of the entire human war effort. The walls were sheets of shifting light. Every research team on the planet reported into this room, and their work flowed across the surfaces in a river of half-finished ideas, and at the center of it, small and iron-voiced and entirely awake, stood Fleet Admiral Chenbury. She did not waste time on ceremony. She brought Ada to a rendering of the Kesarai marches and stood beside her and said, "Show me." So Ada showed her. She showed her the dying giant and the neutron companion, the vast slow spiral of the accretion disk, the long, irregular rhythm of the surges. She showed her the gravitic tide, the swell that rippled out through the marches each time the disk built and collapsed. She spoke the way she thought, in the physical, tactile language of someone who had spent her life inside the machinery of ships, and the admirals in the room, who thought in inventory, leaned in despite themselves, because there was something in the way she talked about the star that made them feel the terrain as a living thing. "It's a tide," Ada said. "That's the wrong word, but it's the closest one. When the disk surges, space itself gets rough for a few minutes across half the marches. Not rough enough to hurt a warship, not even rough enough for a warship to notice unless it's looking. But rough enough to matter, if you know it's coming and they don't." "Matter how?" one of the admirals asked. He was not hostile, he simply did not yet see it. "You said yourself it can't damage a ship." "Can't," Ada agreed. "But it can move one, a little. It bends the space a ship is sitting in so the ship drifts, and its sensors read the drift as their own position error, and their jump calculations get contaminated." She turned to the admiral. "The Concord Armada is 40,000 ships. To move a fleet that size, to have it arrive in formation, to have it fight in formation, they need every ship to agree on where it is, down to the meter, across a volume of space bigger than a solar system. That's the only way a fleet that big works. It's not 40,000 ships making 40,000 decisions. It's 40,000 ships slave to one shared picture of reality. That's their whole strength. That coordination is the reason they've never lost." She let that sit. "The tide," she said, "poisons the picture. When the disk surges, every ship in the marches drifts a little in a different direction by a different amount, depending on exactly where it is. Their shared reality comes apart, not visibly, not enough for them to see it, but enough that their formation stops being a formation and starts being 40,000 ships that each think they're somewhere they're not." The room had gone very quiet. "They're not strong because they're big," Ada said. "They're strong because they're synchronized. And I found the thing that breaks synchronization, and they don't know it's there, and they've decided to hold the trial standing right on top of it." Chenbury looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you known?" 11 days. "And the trigger? You wrote that we have to learn to pull the trigger. The surges are irregular. If we can't predict them, we can't use them." "That," Ada said, "is the homework." It became the whole of her life for the next 2 months. The surges were irregular, but irregular is not the same as random, and the difference between those two words was the difference between defeat and everything else. Ada had spent her career learning to feel the shape of gravity wells, and she had a conviction, unproven but bone deep, that the rhythm of Kesarai was not chaos but a pattern too complex to see with the eye and too simple to be beyond reach. The disk built and collapsed according to the physics of infalling matter, and physics, however complex, obeyed laws, and laws could be learned. She was given a team. This was strange to her. She had spent her career solving problems with her own 2 hands. Now she had 200 people, fluid dynamicists who modeled the accretion disk, gravitational physicists who mapped the tide, data specialists who tore 3 years of survey readings apart looking for the hidden clock. And because the Admiralty had learned to cast its net wide, an assortment of people who did not belong in any category at all. A woman who had spent 40 years predicting the surf on a single stretch of Pacific coast and understood in her body how a chaotic system could still be forecast. A composer who heard the surge data as rhythm and found in it repetitions the mathematicians had missed. A retired miner who had spent his life reading the groans of unstable rock and who looked at the disk's behavior and said flatly that it was going to fail along its stress lines whether they liked it or not, and that if they wanted to know when, they should stop asking when it would surge and start asking when it could not help but surge. That reframing broke the problem open. Ada's team stopped trying to predict the surges and started predicting the collapses, the moments when the accretion disk reached a state it could not sustain and had to give way. Those moments, it turned out, could be forecast, not perfectly, not to the second, but to within a window of a few hours, and then, as the models sharpened, to within a window of 40 minutes and then 20. And 20 minutes, Ada knew, was enough. 20 minutes was more than enough, if you knew what you were going to do with it. Because here was the thing that made her wake in the dark with her heart pounding, not from fear but from the terrible clarity of it. The tide did not have to break the whole Armada. It only had to break the Armada's certainty. And the Armada's certainty was the most brittle thing about it, precisely because it had never once been tested. While Ada learned the clock, the rest of humanity built the trigger. The plan that assembled itself in the reservoir beneath the Admiralty was not the plan of any single mind, and that was its strength and the source of its terror, because no single mind could hold all of it and no single mind could have designed it. It grew the way a coral reef grows, each team adding its piece to the pieces of others, until a shape emerged that none of them had drawn and all of them had made. The shape was this. The human fleet would not try to defeat the Concord Armada. It would try to survive one gravitic surge in the middle of a battle, and to make sure that when the surge came, it hurt the Armada and spared the humans. This required two things. It required knowing when the surge would come, which was Ada's work, and it required every human ship to be immune to the tide when it arrived, while every conquered ship was blind to it, which was the work of everyone else. Immunity, it turned out, was almost easy because the human ships were small, and small ships could do a thing that large ships could not. The tide contaminated navigation because ships trusted their instruments to tell them where they were. But a small ship, in the crucial moment, could stop trusting its instruments. It could go dark, cut its active navigation, and ride the tide the way a small boat rides a swell, letting itself drift with the distortion instead of fighting it, because a ship that drifts with the tide is not thrown out of position relative to the tide. The survey ships had done this for years without thinking about it. It was how you moved through a gravitic reef, by feel, by letting the field carry you. The human fleet, it turned out, was full of people who knew how to do exactly this. Because the human fleet was mostly haulers and survey craft and patrol cutters that had spent their whole existence navigating the rough places the big warships avoided. The Concord Armada could not do this, not because it was incapable but because it was too large. 40,000 ships slaved to one shared picture could not each go dark and ride by feel, because the instant they did, they lost the formation, and without the formation they were not the Concord Armada. Their strength was a cage. The very thing that made them unbeatable in open battle made them unable to do the one thing that would have saved them from the tide. And so the human plan resolved into a single, elegant, monstrous bet. Lure the whole Armada into the marches. Fight just long enough, just convincingly enough to keep them there and keep them synchronized and keep them certain. And then, in the 20-minute window when Ada's clock said the disk was about to collapse, go dark, all 600 ships at once, and let the tide come. If it worked, the humans would ride the swell, and the Armada would be thrown into 40,000 pieces of a picture that no longer matched reality, its formation dissolved, its coordination poisoned, its ships suddenly and catastrophically unable to agree on where they or anyone else were, in the middle of a battle, surrounded by an enemy that could see perfectly. If it failed, humanity would end as an example, exactly as the decree had promised. There was no third outcome. Everyone in the reservoir understood this. And the strange thing, the thing that Ada would remember for the rest of her life, was how calm they were, not resigned, not brave in the loud way. Just calm, the way her hands went calm when she reached into a failing gravitic sink. Because the problem was in front of them, and it was theirs, and there was nothing to do but solve it. There remained the hardest part, and it was the part that fell to Ada, though no one had planned it that way. The whole scheme depended on timing. The fleet had to go dark in the exact window when the disk was about to collapse, and not a moment before, because a fleet that goes dark too early is simply a fleet that has stopped fighting and stopped seeing, a fleet that has volunteered to be slaughtered. The window was 20 minutes wide and it would open exactly once, and if the humans missed it, there would not be another, because the Armada would not need a second surge to finish a fleet that had already spent its one trick. Someone had to call it. Someone had to stand in the middle of the battle with 40,000 warships bearing down and read the invisible clock of a dying star, and know, in the way that could not be taught and could only be felt, the precise moment to give the order that would either save humanity or kill it a few minutes early. Chenbury gave the job to Ada. She did it without ceremony in the reservoir near the end of the second month, when the models were as sharp as they were going to get, and the fleet was as ready as it would ever be. "You found it," the Admiral said. "You learned its rhythm better than anyone alive. When the moment comes, no model is going to tell us it's here. The models give us the window. Inside the window, it's going to be a judgment, and I want the judgment to belong to the one person who spent 3 months listening to that star breathe." Ada was 29 years old. She had spent her career in the guts of ships, solving small, honest problems, avoiding exactly the kind of moment that captains lived for. She had asked for the survey ship because she had never wanted to be the one whose call decided everything. "If I get it wrong," she said, "everyone dies." "If anyone else calls it," Chenbury said, "everyone dies for certain. You are the least wrong option we have. That is the highest praise a soldier ever gets. Take it." Ada took it. That night she went up to the surface, alone, and stood in the cold and looked at the sky, at the thin scatter of stars that did not include Kesarai, too far and too dim to see. She thought about the Concord Armada, 40,000 warships crewed by 200 species, moving even now toward the marches, certain of a victory it had won 10,000 times. She thought about how it had given humanity 90 days out of courtesy, out of the desire to make the example complete, never once imagining that a species could do anything with the time but grieve. She thought they counted our ships, they never counted the star. And she understood, standing there in the cold, that the Concord Armada's greatest mistake was not arrogance, though it was arrogant. It was not underestimating humanity, though it did. Its greatest mistake was far more specific and far more fatal. The Armada had built its entire 11,000-year strength on being able to count, and it had chosen to hold its trial in the one place in the galaxy where the thing that mattered most could not be counted at all. There was, in those weeks of preparation, a moment that Ada would return to often in the years afterward, because it was the moment she understood what kind of war humanity was truly fighting. It came late one night in the reservoir, when the models were stubborn, and the disk refused to yield its clock, and she had been staring at the same wall of shifting light for 11 hours, and had stopped being able to see it. The retired miner found her there, the flat-spoken old man who read the groans of unstable rock, and he sat down beside her without asking, and looked at the render of the accretion disk turning slowly in the dark. "You're trying to predict it," he said. "It was not a question." "That's the assignment," Ada said. "That's the wrong assignment." He gestured at the disk with a scarred hand. "You can't predict rock either. Not really. Every mine I ever worked, the engineers had their models, and the models were always wrong at the edges, and men died at the edges. You know how you actually survive a mine. You don't predict the collapse. You learn what a mine sounds like right before it can't hold anymore, and you listen, and when you hear it, you're already moving. The listening is the thing, not the number, the listening." Ada had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had looked at the disk, and something in her had shifted, quietly and permanently. She had spent her whole life listening, that was the truth of it. She had asked for the survey ship because she preferred the listening to the shooting, and she had been faintly ashamed of it for 7 years, had thought of it as a kind of hiding. The miner had just told her it was the opposite. It was the oldest human skill there was, older than any weapon, the skill that had kept her ancestors alive in a world that was always trying to kill them. To listen to the ground and know, in the body, before the mind could prove it, that it was time to move. "We're not going to predict the star," she said slowly. "We're going to listen to it." "Now you've got it," the old miner said, and he got up, and he left her there, and she did not sleep that night, but for the first time in weeks, the not sleeping felt like progress instead of drowning. It changed how the whole team worked. They stopped chasing a perfect prediction and started building an instrument for listening, a way to feel the disk's approach to collapse in real time, in the moment, the way the survey ships had always felt the reefs. And when Ada understood that the instrument would have a human at the center of it, a person who would listen with 3 months of the star's rhythm in her blood and call the moment by feel, she understood also why the assignment had come to her, and not to a machine. A machine could hold more numbers than she ever could, but a machine could not be uncertain, and uncertainty, it turned out, was the whole point. The window was uncertain. The peak was uncertain. Somewhere inside those uncertainties was a judgment that no equation could make, the judgment of when the star was truly ready, and only a mind that had learned to live inside uncertainty, to act on incomplete knowledge, to move before the proof arrived, could make it. Humanity had spent its entire history making exactly that kind of judgment, at the mouth of every cave and the edge of every mine and the bow of every small ship in rough water, because humanity had never once had the luxury of certainty. The Concord Armada had built its whole existence on certainty, and certainty, Ada was beginning to see, was not strength. It was the absence of the muscle that mattered most. She thought about that a great deal in the last weeks, as the fleet gathered and the 90 days ran down. She thought about a fleet so powerful that it had never had to guess, never had to listen, never had to move before it was sure, and she thought about what such a fleet would do the first time the universe handed it a truth it could not count. It would trust the wrong thing. It would trust the number, the picture, the certainty, because certainty was all it had ever known, and it would trust it right into the dark. The homework, she realized, had never really been about the star at all. The star was only the ground. The real answer, the thing humanity was actually bringing to the marches, was a way of surviving that the galaxy had forgotten was possible, because the galaxy had spent 11,000 years being taught by the Concord Armada that survival was a matter of mass. Humanity was about to teach it otherwise. Humanity was about to teach the whole galaxy, in a single afternoon at a dying star, the oldest lesson the weak had ever learned about the strong, that the ones who cannot lose have never learned to doubt, and the ones who have never learned to doubt can be undone by a single well-timed truth. She just had to listen for the moment to tell it. The Concord Armada arrived at Kesarai over the course of 9 hours, and the arriving was itself a kind of weapon. It did not come all at once. That would have been merely a fleet. Instead it unfolded, wave after wave, each formation dropping out of the deep dark in perfect order, taking its assigned position in a battle sphere so vast that light took most of an hour to cross it, and then the next wave arriving, and the next, until the emptiness beyond Kesarai was no longer empty but occupied, wall to wall, by the assembled might of the galaxy. The 9,000 ships larger than moons anchored the formation like the pillars of a cathedral. Between them, the 31,000 lesser warships wove a lattice of firepower so dense that the human sensors, watching from the fleet's assembly point at the march's edge, could not resolve individual ships at all past a certain depth, only a solid glowing mass, a second star being born out of steel and malice. The human fleet watched it arrive. 612 ships, most of them not warships, holding position at the edge of the marches, and every soul aboard them saw the thing that was unfolding across the dark and understood, in a way no briefing could have conveyed, exactly what they had chosen to face. Ada watched from the flag bridge of the fleet's command ship, a converted heavy hauler renamed Anvil for the occasion, because there had been no warship large enough to serve, and the Admiralty had decided there was a certain honesty in commanding from a repurposed workhorse. She stood beside Chenbury, and she watched the Armada assemble, and she felt her own smallness settle over her like cold water. She had spent 2 months thinking of the Armada as a problem, a system with a flaw, a lock with a key. Now she saw it as a thing, and the thing was so far beyond human scale that for a moment her certainty guttered like a candle. Then she made herself look, not at the fleet, but past it, into the marches themselves, where the dying giant of Kesarai bled its slow wind into the dark, and the neutron companion wound the shed matter into its vast hidden spiral. She could not see the accretion disk with her eyes, but she had spent 3 months learning to feel it, and she felt it now, breathing, building, its long, slow rhythm running beneath the impossible spectacle of the Armada like a heartbeat beneath a scream. And her certainty came back, because the star did not care how big the fleet was. The tide would come whether there were 6 ships in the marches or 6 million, and when it came, it would not check anyone's inventory. "They're beautiful," Chenbury said quietly, watching the Armada finish its unfolding. "I'll give them that. 11,000 years, and they've made war into a thing that has no answer. You can't fault them for believing it." "They can be beautiful," Ada said. "They just can't be right." The formalities came first, because the Concord Armada believed in dignity for the Wade. Grand Marshal Vostalerian addressed the human fleet directly, ship to ship, his image rendered on every human bridge at once. He was old in the way of his species, which meant something the humans could not fully parse, a slow, deep patience that had watched civilizations rise and fall and had long ago stopped being moved by any of it. He was not cruel. That was the thing that struck Ada most, watching him. He was not gloating, not threatening, not savoring the moment. He was performing a rite he had performed 1,000 times, with the grave courtesy of a judge passing a sentence he considered just. "People of Earth," he said, "you came. We are glad of it. Too often the Wade choose to hide, to scatter, to force us to hunt them across their little worlds, and there is no dignity in that for them or for us. You have chosen instead to stand in full and be measured. This is the honorable choice, and we honor it." He paused. Across 612 human bridges, no one spoke. "Understand what is about to happen," Vostalerian continued. "We do not hate you. We do not fear you. We have weighed 200 species into the Concord, and each of them at this moment believed as you believe now, that they were the exception, that their courage or their cleverness or their cause would prove the difference. None of them was the exception. There is no exception. There is only the Concord and those who have not yet joined it. In an hour, you will understand this, and those of you who survive will understand it for the rest of your lives, and your children will be born into a galaxy that has finally been made complete. This is not a tragedy. It is an arithmetic, 40,000 against 600. We give you this last hour to make your peace with the number. Use it as you see fit." His image faded. On the bridge of the anvil, Chenbury let out a slow breath. "An arithmetic," she said. "He said it himself. He thinks we don't understand the number." "He's right," Ada said. "We don't understand his number. We understand a different one." She was watching the marches, the invisible breathing of the star, her hand resting on the edge of the fire control station that had been built for her, the station from which she would read the clock and call the moment. "His number is 40,000. Ours is 20 minutes. Chenbury looked at her. "How long?" Ada closed her eyes and felt for the rhythm, the long, slow build of the disk, and matched it against 3 months of models running in the back of her mind. "The disk is building toward a collapse," she said. "The window opens in a little under 4 hours. It stays open for 20 minutes. If we can keep them here and keep them fighting until then without dying first, we get our one chance." 4 hours, Chenbury said. "We have to survive 4 hours against 40,000 warships, and we have to do it convincingly enough that they never suspect we're waiting for anything." "Yes. And if they finish us before the window opens?" "Then we were wrong," Ada said, and it won't matter what we suspected. The battle began without drama because the Concord Armada did not do drama. It did procedure. At the appointed moment, the nearest formations of the Armada advanced, not in a headlong rush but in a slow, grinding, inexorable pressure, a wall of warships moving forward in perfect unison, their fire opening up across the marches in a lattice so coordinated that it did not look like 40,000 ships shooting, but like a single vast machine bringing its weight to bear. The human fleet, which had spent 2 months learning exactly how not to be where that weight fell, gave ground. This was the plan. The human ships were small and they were fast, and above all they knew the marches, knew every gravitic eddy and reef, and they used them, threading through distortions the Armada's ships avoided, sheltering behind gravity wells that scrambled the big warship's fire, never standing, never massing, never presenting the solid target the Armada's coordinated firepower was designed to annihilate. They fought like a school of fish against a whale, and the whale, for all its size, could not close its jaws on water. But it could exhaust them. That was the danger, and everyone aboard the human ships felt it. The Armada did not tire. It did not run low on ships or fire or patience. It simply pressed and pressed and pressed, and every minute of pressing cost the humans a little. A ship lost here, a formation scattered there, a pilot's nerve fraying under the relentless grinding weight of an enemy that could afford to lose 100 ships for every one of theirs, and would still have 39,000 left. The math that the humans could not fight in the open reasserted itself slowly, patiently, as attrition. In 4 hours at this rate, there might not be a human fleet left to go dark. Ada watched the losses climb from her station and felt each one, and made herself not react, because her job was not the battle. Her job was the star. She sat inside the roar of the fight and listened past it, to the slow breathing of the disk, and she held the fleet's one chance in her hands and refused to spend it early no matter what it cost. An hour in, the human losses passed 40 ships. Chenbury, commanding the Survival, moving the fleet like a living thing across the marches, spending gravity wells and reefs the way a fencer spends distance, came to Ada's station between crises. "We're bleeding," the Admiral said. "Faster than the models said. They adapted quicker than we thought. They're using their mass to seal off the reefs, cutting our escape routes. In 3 more hours we'll have lost a third of the fleet, maybe more." "The window's still 3 hours out," Ada said. "I know. Can we survive 3 more hours of this?" Ada looked at the tactical display, at the 600 human ships dwindling toward 540, at the wall of the Armada pressing in on every side, sealing the marches one reef at a time. "No," she said. "Not like this. They'll grind us down before the window. We need to slow them. We need to make them cautious, make them stop pressing, by time we don't have any other way to buy." "How?" And Ada, who had spent her career solving small, honest problems in the guts of ships, looked at the largest problem any human had ever faced, and did the thing humans did, which was to take the situation apart and put it back together wrong, on purpose, in a way that did what she needed. "They're synchronized," she said slowly. "That's their strength, but it's also how they think. Every ship trusts the shared picture. What if we poison a little corner of it? Not the whole thing, not yet, just enough to scare them." The idea that assembled itself in the next 10 minutes was not strictly part of the plan. The plan called for one great darkness at the moment of the surge, but the plan had been built in the calm of the reservoir, and battles are not calm, and the deepest strength of the human way of war was that the plan was never the point. The point was the people who could rewrite it in the middle, with the enemy's fire closing in, because they understood the problem instead of merely executing a solution. Ada's insight was this: the Armada's ships trusted their shared picture of reality absolutely, because in 11,000 years it had never once been wrong. That trust was a strength when the picture was accurate, but it was a vulnerability the moment the picture lied, because a fleet that has never been deceived has never learned to doubt. and the marches were full of gravity wells, and gravity wells bent light and sensor returns, and a small ship that knew the reefs could position itself to make a big warship see something that was not there. The human survey ships knew exactly how to do this, because avoiding false gravitic returns was half of what surveying was. Now, instead of avoiding them, they would create them. A dozen of the fastest human cutters peeled off, threading into the reefs at the edge of the Armada's advancing wall, and positioned themselves at the focal points of the gravity wells, and began broadcasting, not weapons fire, but sensor ghosts. False returns bent and multiplied by the wells until each cutter appeared to the Armada's synchronized picture as a squadron, a formation, a threat massing in the reefs where the big warships could not safely follow. The Armada's shared reality, which had never been wrong, reported human forces where there were almost none, and the Armada, trusting the picture as it always had, did the rational thing. It slowed. It turned formations to face threats that did not exist. It committed firepower to empty reefs. Its perfect coordination, its greatest strength, became the vector by which a lie propagated through 40,000 ships at once, because they all trusted the same poisoned picture, and none of them had ever learned to doubt it. It did not last. Within 20 minutes the Armada's analysis caught the deception, recognized the ghosts for what they were, and resumed its pressure. But 20 minutes was 20 minutes in which the human losses slowed to a trickle, 20 minutes bought out of nothing but understanding. And more than the time, it bought something Ada had not expected and did not fully understand until later. It planted a seed of the very thing the Armada had never possessed. It made the Armada, for the first time in 11,000 years, uncertain of its own picture of the world. Vostalirian felt it. On the flag deck of the Armada's greatest ship, the old Grand Marshal watched his flawless formation hesitate over phantoms, watched his synchronized fleet spend fire on empty space, and felt a thing he had not felt in 4 centuries, a small cold flicker of a question. Not fear, not yet, just the unfamiliar sensation of not being certain that what he saw was true. He did not know it, but the humans had just shown him the shape of his own death. They had taken his strength, his perfect shared picture of reality, and demonstrated that it could be made to lie. The ghosts were a small lie, quickly caught. But the star was building toward a lie so large that no analysis would catch it in time, because it would not come from the humans at all. It would come from the terrain, from the tide, from the one variable the Armada had never counted, and when it came, the Armada's greatest strength would carry it, at the speed of trust, straight into catastrophe. Ada watched the losses slow and let herself breathe. 2 hours and 40 minutes to the window. The fleet was hurt but alive, and the enemy, for the first time in 11,000 years, had begun to doubt. The next 2 hours were the longest of Ada Aconquer's life, and she would remember them not as a battle, but as a vigil. The ghosts had bought time, but the Armada learned, and a fleet of 40,000 ships and 200 species had a great deal of learning to draw on. Within the hour, Vostalirian had changed his method. He stopped trusting the reefs to his synchronized picture and began sending small, independent scouts ahead, single ships released from the shared reality, tasked to confirm with their own sensors before the fleet committed. It was slower. It was clumsier. It went against the entire philosophy of the Concord Armada, which was that no ship should ever have to think for itself. But it worked, and the human ghosts lost their power, because you cannot fool a fleet that has learned to check. Ada watched the old Grand Marshal adapt and felt a grudging awe. He was not a fool. None of them were fools. That was the thing humans always had to learn about the galaxy the hard way, that the powerful were not powerful by accident, that 11,000 years of victory had been earned by minds every bit as sharp as humanity's, in bodies far older and fleets far vaster. The Concord Armada's arrogance was not stupidity. It was the arrogance of a champion who had genuinely never lost, and there is no arrogance more dangerous, because it is backed by a real and terrible competence. But competence has a grain, and Ada had spent her career learning to read the grain of things, and she saw the grain of the Armada now. Every adaptation Vostalirian made pulled the fleet a little further from what it was. The scouts, the caution, the checking, all of it was the Armada becoming less itself, becoming slower and less coordinated, precisely in order to survive the deceptions the humans had shown it. The old Grand Marshal was trading his synchronization for safety, a little at a time, and he did not fully realize what he was doing, because he had never before been in a fight where synchronization was a liability. He was solving the last problem. He did not know that the real problem had not yet arrived. And the fleet bled, slower now but steadily, 500 human ships, 460. The Armada's patient grinding pressure resumed, and the marches filled with the wreckage of human vessels, and every loss was a crew Ada had helped train, a ship whose system she had studied, a name on the roster that scrolled at the edge of her station. She made herself watch. She made herself not look away, because looking away was a luxury and the fleet had no luxuries left, and because she owed the dead the small honor of knowing what they were dying to buy. 40 minutes to the window, she said when the count came. Chenbury, gray-faced and iron-voiced, running the survival of the human species with the calm of a woman who had accepted long ago that she might not survive the day, nodded. Can we last it? Ada looked at the fleet, 440 ships. The Armada tightening its grip, sealing the last of the reefs, beginning at last to mass its firepower for the killing pressure it had held in reserve. It's going to be close, she said. They're done being cautious. They think they've solved us. They're going to close the jaws now. Then we let them, Chenbury said. It's what we need. We need them committed. We need them massed and confident and pressing in with everything so that when the tide comes it takes all of them at once. She turned to Ada. This is the part where we stop running. This is the part where we make them think they've won so completely that they stop checking, so completely that they synchronize again for the kill. Can you time it? Yes, Ada said. And then, because it was true, and because the Admiral deserved the truth. If I'm wrong by even a few minutes, we'll have stopped running for nothing, and they'll finish us before the tide arrives. You won't be wrong, Chenbury said, and it was not reassurance. It was an order and a faith and the last thing she could give. So the human fleet stopped running. It was the hardest thing Chenbury had ever ordered and the hardest thing the human crews had ever done. For nearly 4 hours they had survived by never standing still, by threading the reefs, by being the school of fish the whale could not bite. Now, on command, they gathered. They pulled in from the reefs and the eddies and the sheltering gravity wells, and they massed at the center of the marches, 440 ships forming up into something that finally looked like a fleet making its last stand, a defiant knot of humanity offering itself at last to the killing blow. To the Concord Armada it read exactly as intended. The prey had run until it could run no more, and now, cornered, it did what all cornered prey eventually did. It turned to die with its face to the enemy. Vostalirian had seen it 200 times, the final gathering, the last defiance, the moment when the Wade accepted the weight. He had honored it 200 times, and he honored it now, and he gave the order to end it, and the Concord Armada abandoned its hard-learned caution and did the thing it did best. It synchronized. Across the vast battle sphere, 40,000 warships and the 9,000 larger-than moons drew back into perfect coordination. Their scouts recalled, their independent thinking set aside, their shared picture of reality reasserted in full, because the deceptions no longer mattered, because the prey was cornered and there was nothing left to check, because the kill was a matter of overwhelming coordinated force, and coordinated force was what the Armada was. The lattice of firepower knit itself back together, denser and more total than ever. Every ship slaved once more to the single shared reality that had never, in 11,000 years, been wrong. Ada watched it happen on her station, watched the Armada's coordination climb back toward perfection, and felt her heart pound with the terrible clarity that had woken her in the dark for 2 months. This was it. This was the trap closing, and it was closing on the trapper. The Armada was doing exactly what the human plan required, resynchronizing for the kill, weaving itself back into the single shared picture that the tide would tear apart. The old Grand Marshal, in his competence, in his experience, in his flawless reading of a cornered enemy, had made the one move that would destroy him. He had trusted the picture, because he had never had a reason not to. "The window," Ada said, her voice was very quiet, "it's opening." She could feel it. 3 months of listening and she felt the disc reach the state it could not sustain, felt the long, slow build cross the threshold into collapse, felt the tide begin, far out in the marches, invisible, silent, rising. The models had given her a window of 20 minutes. Her body, her intuition, 3 months of the stars' rhythm running in her blood, told her the truth the models could not. That the collapse was not a window but a wave, that it had a leading edge and a peak and a trailing edge, and that the peak, the moment of maximum distortion, would come not at the start of the window but near its middle, 11 minutes from now. 11 minutes. 11 minutes of standing still, of taking the Armada's killing fire, of holding the fleet in place and not going dark too soon, because if they went dark before the peak they would ride a lesser swell, and the Armada would ride it too, and the whole gambit would fail. They had to wait for the peak. They had to take 11 minutes of the worst the Concord Armada could deliver, massed and synchronized and certain, and they had to survive it, so that when they finally went dark, the tide would be at its height and the Armada at its most coordinated and therefore its most fragile. "Admiral," Ada said, "the peak is 11 minutes out. We have to hold until then, not the window, the peak." 11 minutes. Chen Burry looked at the tactical display, at 440 human ships about to receive the full synchronized fury of 40,000, and understood what 11 minutes meant. How many of us will be left in 11 minutes? "I don't know," Ada said. "Enough, I hope. It has to be the peak. If we go dark now they ride it with us. It has to be the peak." Chen Burry was silent for a moment. Then she opened the fleet-wide channel, and she spoke to every human in the marches, 440 ships full of people who were about to be asked to stand still and be shot. "This is the Admiral," she said. "In 11 minutes we go dark and the star fights for us. Until then we hold. I will not lie to you about what the next 11 minutes will cost. Hold anyway. Everything we are, everything we came here to be is those 11 minutes. Hold the line and let me do the rest. Hold and we win. Chen Burry out." And the human fleet held. The 11 minutes were slaughter, and Ada would carry them for the rest of her life. The Concord Armada, synchronized and certain, brought its full weight to bear at last, and the full weight of 40,000 warships was a thing beyond any human experience of violence. The massed human fleet, standing still by design, absorbed it, and could not help but be torn apart by it. The lattice of coordinated fire fell on the human ships like the closing of a fist, and ship after ship died, and Ada watched the roster scroll and made herself read every name, because someone had to, because these were the 11 minutes, because this was the price of the 20 seconds that would come after. 440 ships, 400, 360. The anvil itself shuddered under repeated hits, its converted hull never meant for this, its damage control teams dying at their stations to keep it alive. Chen Burry stood at the center of the flag bridge with wreckage falling around her and did not flinch, holding the fleet in place with the sheer force of her refusal to break. And Ada stood at her station with her hand on the fire control panel and her eyes half closed, feeling the tide, counting not seconds but the rhythm of the star, waiting for the peak. 300 ships, 280. The marches were a graveyard, filling with the wreckage of humanity's fleet, and Vostalirian, watching from his great ship, felt the old certainty settle over him fully, the certainty of 200 victories, the certainty that this was, as it had always been, an arithmetic. The prey had made its last stand and was being unmade, and in a few more minutes it would be over, and humanity would be a line in the ledger, weighed and found wanting, and the galaxy would be complete. He did not feel the tide. Why would he? It was slow and subtle, and beneath the notice of a fleet that thought in gigatons. The accretion disk of a dying star was not a variable in the arithmetic of war. It could not damage a warship. It could not even inconvenience one. It was terrain, and terrain was empty, and the stage was empty, and the Armada's perfect synchronized picture of reality reported, as it always had, exactly and only what the Armada expected to see. "Peak in 60 seconds, Ada said. 240 human ships remained. "Peak in 30 seconds. Her voice did not shake. She had not known it would not shake. She had feared for 2 months that when the moment came she would freeze, that the weight of it would break her, that she would call it wrong. But the moment was here, and she was not afraid, because the star was breathing in her blood, and she knew its rhythm the way she knew her own heartbeat. And she was, at last, simply doing the thing she had been made for, which was to read the shape of a gravity well and know its truth. "Peak in 10 seconds. Admiral, on my mark, the whole fleet goes dark, every ship all at once. No exceptions." "On your mark," Chenbury said. Ada felt the tide rise toward its height, felt the disk's collapse reach its violent maximum, felt the space of the marches begin to bend and roil as a wave of gravitic distortion swept out from the dying star toward the mast and synchronized an utterly unsuspecting Concord Armada. "Mark," she said, go dark now." And 240 human ships, all at once, in the same instant, cut their active navigation and their sensors and their fire and went silent and blind and dark, and stopped fighting the space they were in, and let the tide take them. For the humans, going dark was an act of trust so total it felt like dying. Every instinct a spacefarer has screams against it. To cut your sensors in the middle of a battle, to blind yourself while an enemy's fire falls around you, to stop trusting your instruments and surrender your position to the raw motion of space itself, is to violate everything training teaches. But the human crews had trained for exactly this for 2 months, and more than that, most of them had done it their whole careers without a name for it, in the reefs and eddies of the frontier, where the only way through the rough places was to stop fighting the field and let it carry you. They went dark, and they rode. And the tide took them, and because they had gone dark, because they had stopped insisting on where they were and simply let the distortion move them, the tide did not throw them out of position relative to itself. They drifted with the swell. Their formation, such as it was, deformed as a whole. Every ship carried the same way by the same wave, so that relative to one another they held. A small boat rising on a swell does not capsize. It rises. 240 human ships rose on the gravitic tide of a dying star, blind and silent and perfectly, deliberately, unresisting, and they came through it whole. The Concord Armada did not go dark. The Concord Armada could not go dark, because to go dark was to lose the synchronization that was its entire being, and no one had given the order, and no order could have been given, because the fleet's whole nature was built on the shared picture, and the shared picture reported no reason to abandon it. 40,000 warships and 9,000 larger than moons sat in the marches at the peak of their coordination, slaved to a single reality, and the tide came, and it hit every one of them at once. It did not damage them. Ada had been right about that from the start. The tide could not scratch a warship's hull or dim a warship's fire. What it did was worse and quieter and absolutely fatal. It moved them. Each ship, sitting in its assigned position, was carried by the gravitic distortion a small distance in a slightly different direction by a slightly different amount, depending on exactly where in the vast battle sphere it sat, because the tide was not uniform, because a wave that spans a solar system does not lift every point the same way. And each ship's instruments, still active, still trusted, still slave to the shared picture, read the movement not as an external tide but as the ship's own drift, its own position error, and dutifully reported it to the fleet. And the shared picture, which had never in 11,000 years been wrong, tried to make sense of 40,000 simultaneous position errors, each one different, none of them errors at all but the fingerprint of a tide the picture did not know existed. And the picture came apart. It did not come apart slowly. It came apart at the speed of trust, which is the speed of light and the speed of certainty combined, because every ship in the Armada instantly and automatically shared its contaminated data with every other ship, and the contamination propagated through the entire synchronized fleet in the time it took a signal to cross the battle sphere, and the shared reality that bound 40,000 ships into a single machine became, in the space of a few seconds, 40,000 different and mutually contradictory answers to the question of where anything was. The Armada's greatest strength became the vector of its ruin. If the ships had each thought for themselves, each trusted only its own sensors, the tide would have confused them individually, and they would have recovered individually. But they did not think for themselves. They had never needed to. They trusted the shared picture above their own eyes, and the shared picture was now poison, and they trusted the poison, because trusting the picture was the one thing they had never learned to stop doing. 40,000 warships at the peak of their coordination, in the middle of delivering a killing blow, suddenly could not agree on where they were, where their allies were, where the enemy was, or where their own fire was going. Grand Marshal Vostalerian felt the certainty of 11,000 years dissolve beneath him in the space of 10 seconds, and he did not understand it, and the not understanding was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to him. His flagship's picture of the battle, always crystalline, always true, dissolved into chaos. The human fleet which had been dying in front of him simply vanished from the shared reality, gone dark, unreadable, and in the same instant his own fleet's position scrambled into nonsense. 40,000 ships reporting themselves in places they could not be. The formation he had held for 11,000 years reporting itself as a formation that no longer existed. He gave orders and the orders could not be executed, because execution required knowing where the ships were, and no one knew where the ships were, because the picture that had always told them was lying and they did not know it was lying, and they trusted it, and it killed them. The coordinated fire of the Concord Armada, which required every ship to know precisely where every other ship in the enemy were, now had no precise knowledge of anything. And 40,000 warships continued to fire, because they had been given the order to destroy the enemy, and the order had not been rescinded, and they fired into a shared picture that no longer matched reality, and the picture told them the enemy was where the enemy was not, and it told them, catastrophically, that their own ships were where their own ships were not. The Concord Armada, blind to the truth and certain of a lie, opened fire on itself. It was not a rout. A rout implies flight, and the Armada could not flee, because fleeing required coordination, and coordination was the very thing that had shattered. It was not a battle because the humans, dark and silent, riding the tide, were not even fighting. It was something the galaxy had never seen and would speak of for 10,000 years. It was the greatest fleet ever assembled tearing itself apart in the dark, ship firing on ship, formation firing on formation. The 9,000 behemoths larger than moons turning their world-ending weapons on targets the poisoned picture insisted were human, and were in fact each other, because the picture was all they had ever trusted, and the picture had turned traitor, and they could not stop trusting it in time. The tide lasted 4 minutes at its peak. In those 4 minutes, the Concord Armada destroyed more of itself than the combined navies of 200 conquered species had ever managed across 11,000 years of resistance. And it did it in perfect, coordinated, synchronized order, every ship acting on the same shared reality, the same shared reality that had made it invincible, that had made it certain, that had made it, in the end, the perfect instrument of its own destruction. When the tide subsided, the human fleet came back to life. 240 ships, blind and dark, felt the swell pass its peak and begin to fall, and one by one, As Ada gave the word, they came out of the dark, restoring their sensors, restoring their picture of a marches transformed. Where the Concord Armada had stood in perfect array, there was now a vast and drifting ruin, thousands of warships crippled or dead or firing still into the confusion. The great synchronized machine broken into 40,000 terrified and disoriented pieces, each one alone for the first time in its existence, each one suddenly forced to think for itself, and discovering that it had never learned how. Ada stood at her station and looked at what the star had done, at what the plan had done, at what 2 months of frightened, brilliant human minds had done, and she felt no triumph. She felt something vaster and colder and closer to awe. The Concord Armada had been the single greatest concentration of power the galaxy had ever known, and it was gone, not defeated but undone, dismantled by its own strength turned against it, and the fleet that had undone it was standing in the wreckage, 240 small ships, most of them not even warships, blinking their sensors back on and hardly able to believe what they saw. Chenbury's voice came quiet across the flag bridge. "Signal them," she said. "The Armada, any of them who can still receive, open channel." The channel opened, and Chenbury spoke to what remained of the greatest fleet in the galaxy, and her voice was not triumphant either. It was tired, and it was iron, and it was, above all, merciful in a way the Concord Armada had never once been to anyone. "Grand Marshal," she said, "this is the Admiral of the human fleet. You gave us 90 days. You thought you were giving us time to make our peace. You were giving us time to prepare. You could not tell the difference because in 11,000 years no one ever taught you what a species does with time when its survival depends on it. We did not outgun you. We did not outmass you. We simply understood the ground you chose to stand on better than you did, because you never bothered to look at it, because you had reduced war to a number and forgotten that the universe is not a number. Your strength destroyed you. Your synchronization destroyed you. Your certainty destroyed you. We only had to wait for the star." There was a long silence on the channel. And then Vostalirian answered, and his voice was the voice of a being who had watched civilizations rise and fall and had never, until this moment, been afraid of anything. "How was all he said?" "You counted our ships," Chenbury said. "You never counted the star. That was your biggest mistake. It has always been the mistake the powerful make about the ones they think are weak. You looked at what we had, and you never once asked what we knew." The reckoning that followed was aimed, precisely and deliberately, at the fleet and nothing else. The humans did not pursue the surviving conquered ships to their worlds. They did not turn the star's weapon on the 200 client species, most of whom had served the Armada out of the same fear that the Armada had used to conquer them. They did not become, in victory, the thing they had defeated. Chenbury had been clear about this from the first night in the reservoir. The reckoning was for the Armada, for the machine of conquest, for the 11,000-year certainty that had reduced 200 civilizations to lines in a ledger. It was not for the crews who had been born into service, not for the client worlds, not for anyone who had not chosen to challenge humanity certain of its destruction. The humans offered the survivors passage home and safe conduct, and the one thing the Concord Armada had never offered anyone, which was the choice to simply leave. Most of them left. The Concord Armada, as a fact around which the galaxy had been arranged for 11,000 years, ceased to exist, not because humanity destroyed it, but because it destroyed itself the instant it was made to doubt. And the client species, freed from the fear that had bound them, scattered into a galaxy that would have to learn, for the first time in 11 millennia, to arrange itself around something other than a single overwhelming fleet. And the galaxy, watching, did the arithmetic that mattered. It did not count the human ships, 440 gone to 240, a fleet that had never been able to win on inventory and had never tried. It counted something else, something the Concord Armada had spent 11,000 years teaching everyone to ignore. It counted what humanity had known. It counted the young officer who had spent 3 years learning the shape of a dying star while everyone else chased glory in the patrol lanes, and who had found, in the slow breathing of an accretion disk, a weapon the size of a solar system that the greatest fleet in history had dismissed as an empty stage. It counted the 200 frightened brilliant people in a reservoir beneath the Admiralty who had refused to solve the problem from the top down, and had built instead a plan no single mind could hold. It counted the crews who had gone dark in the middle of a battle and trusted the star, and the admiral who had held the line for 11 minutes of slaughter to buy 20 seconds of truth. Ada Conquerez was 30 years old when the galaxy learned to count what humanity knew. She stood on the flag bridge of a converted hauler in a marches full of the ruined greatest fleet in history, and she looked at the dying star that had fought for them, and she understood at last why she had asked for the survey ship, why she had spent her career learning terrain instead of chasing battle. It was because she had always known, without words, the thing the Concord Armada had learned too late and paid for with 11,000 years of certainty. That the universe is not an inventory, that the stage is never empty, and that the greatest fleet ever assembled is only as strong as its willingness to look at the ground beneath its feet. The galaxy's greatest fleet had challenged humanity, certain of victory, and it had been the last mistake it ever made. Not because humanity was stronger, because humanity had bothered to learn the one thing that could not be counted, and the Concord Armada, in all its overwhelming might, had never once thought to look.